Imagine, if you can, the silence of a winter canyon. It isn't a peaceful silence, but a heavy, suffocating blanket of snow and despair. In the heart of this frozen void sits a woman. She is 66 years old, her leg is paralyzed, and she has nothing left: no tent, no fire, and no food. Beside her, an old man weeps, begging for the sweet release of death. But Tabitha Brown is not listening to his surrender. She's searching the mud and ice for the one tiny, bitter thing that might save them both. This is the story of how a grandmother conquered the impossible. The year was 1846, and America was gripped by a fever. It was a burning desire to push westward into the vast, unknown territories of the Oregon country. Thousands of families were selling their farms and packing their entire lives into fragile wooden wagons, pointing their oxen toward the setting sun. They were chasing a dream of fertile land and new beginnings, but the path to paradise was often paved with shallow graves. While history usually remembers the strong young men who tamed the frontier, this particular winter would test a different kind of hero. One whose strength lay not in muscle or youth, but in an unbreakable will that refused to flicker out, even when the world turned to ice. To understand the sheer magnitude of the ordeal that was to come, we must first meet the unlikely protagonist of our tale. Tabitha Moffat Brown was, by the harsh standards of the 19th century, a woman at the end of her journey. At 66 years old, she was a widow from Missouri, a woman who by all rights should have been enjoying the twilight of her years in a rocking chair by a warm hearth. But fate, and a cruel bout of fever years prior, had dealt her a difficult hand. That illness had left her right leg partially paralyzed, rendering every single step a calculated negotiation with pain. She walked with a heavy, hand-carved wooden cane, her movement slow and labored. In the unforgiving wilderness of the West, such a physical vulnerability was considered more than a burden. It was a fatal liability. Yet, beneath this frail exterior beat a heart of absolute steel. Tabitha was not a woman who accepted pity, nor was she one to be told what she could or could not do. When her son, Oris Brown, and her daughter, Fernie Pringle, made the monumental decision to join the Great Migration to Oregon, Tabitha flatly refused to be left behind as a relic of the past. She didn't just ask to go. She outfitted her own wagon, organizing her supplies with the meticulous eye of a matriarch who had managed households through decades of hardship. She knew she would be a burden to the wagon train if she could not keep up, so she resolved to be tougher than the granite mountains they would eventually have to cross. There was a specific detail about Tabitha that her family knew well, a trait that would prove more valuable than gunpowder or gold in the months ahead. She knew the land the way most people knew their own hands, every ridge, every hollow, every season's demand. While other pioneers looked at the passing landscape and saw only scenery or obstacles, Tabitha saw a pantry. She had spent a lifetime understanding the subtle, quiet language of nature. She knew what grew in the deep shade of an oak tree, which roots could soothe a raging fever, and which bitter nuts could sustain a life when the flour barrel finally ran dry. As the wagons rolled out of Missouri in the spring of 1846, creaking under the weight of hope, Tabitha sat perched on the bench. Her paralyzed leg was stiff and aching, but her sharp eyes were already scanning the passing hedgerows for anything that might be useful. She was the sympathetic underdog of this caravan, the one everyone whispered about when the campfires burned low. They expected her to be the first to fall. They had no idea that she was the iron spine that would eventually hold them all together. The journey began well enough, the heavy wooden wagons cutting deep, rhythmic ruts into the prairie sod as they marched through the long days of spring and early summer. But the mood shifted dramatically in August, when the party finally reached Fort Hall in what we now know as Idaho. The air here was thick with the smell of parched livestock, dry timber, and the constant fine grit of dust that seemed to coat everything in a pale gray film. This was the last true outpost of civilization, a rugged point of no return where every traveler had to commit to their final route. It was here that a shadow fell over the expedition in the form of a man with a silver tongue and a dangerous promise. A guide, working for the explorer Jesse Applegate, approached the wagon train with a proposition that sounded almost too good to be true. He stood by the main gate of the fort, leaning against a weathered post and carving a piece of cedar with a small knife as he spoke. He talked of the traditional route down the Columbia River with fear and trembling, painting vivid, terrifying pictures of treacherous rapids that swallowed wagons whole and impassable cliffs that could tear the heavy wheels from their axles. He even whispered of the tragedy of the Donner Party. While their full fate wasn't known yet, the rumors of their delays and the winter snows were already haunting the trails like ghosts. But, he claimed with a confident, easy smile, there was another way, a new way. He called it the Southern Route. He promised a road that was smooth and safe, a path that would bypass the deadly Columbia and lead them gently into the Willamette Valley before the first winter snows could trap them in the heights. It was a siren song to exhausted travelers who were already terrified of the river's power. The debate around the campfires those nights was fierce and desperate, the flickering orange flames casting long, dancing shadows against the canvas wagons. The seasoned maps and the older mountain men said one thing, but this confident guide said another. Tabitha sat in the shadows of her wagon, her hands busy with a piece of mending, her intuition prickling. He had the unmistakable feeling of having missed something obvious, something right in front of him. She looked at her elderly brother-in-law, Captain John Brown, a man of 77 years who had joined their trek. He sat nearby on a crate, his head bowed, his breath coming in slow, tired sighs. He was tired. They were all so tired. The promise of an easier road was intoxicating, like a cool drink of water to a man dying of thirst in the desert. Against their better judgment, and swayed by the fear-mongering about the Northern River route, the family made the fateful decision to turn south. They turned their wagons away from the known dangers and steered directly into a trap set by geography itself. It is a moment that defines so many survival stories, the choice to take the shortcut that leads to ruin. If you want to see how this decision unravels into one of the most harrowing survival stories of the frontier and ensure you don't miss future episodes about history's forgotten heroes, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel right now. Your support helps us bring these incredible lives out of the shadows and keep their stories alive. Now, as the dust settled at Fort Hall and the wind began to pick up, rattling the wagon covers against their wooden frames, Tabitha Brown's wagon train rolled south, leaving safety and the known world behind. They were heading into the unknown, and the mountains were waiting for them with cold, indifferent silence. At first, the southern route seemed to keep its promises, or at least it maintained the cruel illusion of passability. The caravan moved through the high desert, where the heavy wooden wheels made a constant, rhythmic crunching sound as they rolled over brittle sagebrush and hard-packed earth. The air out there was thin and crisp, filled with the sharp, medicinal scent of dry pine and the ever-present grit of fine dust that seemed to coat every surface, from the canvas tops of the wagons to the very back of their throats. For a few weeks, there was a genuine sense of renewed optimism among the families. They felt like they were forging a new trail, pioneers in the truest sense of the word, carving a path where few had dared to go. Tabitha, despite the jarring motion of the wagon sending constant, throbbing shocks of pain through her paralyzed limb, maintained a stoic dignity. She sat on her hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, and watched the horizon change from the rolling green of the prairies to the stark, dramatic geology of the Great Basin. The sensory details of those early weeks on the Applegate Trail were deceptive. The sun was warm on their faces, feeling like a gentle hand after the long journey, and the nights were cool but manageable, the stars overhead looking like spilled diamonds on black velvet. The water, though sometimes bitter with the chalky taste of alkali, was still available if you knew where to look in the dry creek beds. Tabitha would sit by the evening fire, her fingers moving with practiced ease as she mended clothes, the needle clicking softly against her thimble while she listened to the lowing of the oxen and the distant howl of a coyote. She observed the landscape with that same critical, gathering eye she had used back in Missouri. She noticed the scrub oak and the hardy bushes that clung to life in the rocky soil with a stubbornness she recognized in herself. She watched how the local wildlife scurried and hid, surviving on the smallest of scraps, and she wondered if they were being watched in return. She was learning the rhythm of this new land, even as the others simply tried to endure it. However, the golden haze of late summer eventually began to fade, replaced by the sharpening, cold angles of autumn light that made everything look brittle. The days grew noticeably shorter, and the shadows in the canyons grew longer and darker, stretching out like fingers reaching for the wagons. The distances between waterholes grew until they were agonizing stretches of thirst, where the only sound was the dry rattle of the wind in the grass. The easy, flat terrain began to buckle and fold into jagged hills and deep, rocky ravines that seemed designed to break a wagon's spirit. The oxen, the very engines of their survival, began to show their ribs through their dusty hides, their breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps that worried the drivers. The sensory experience of the journey shifted from the clean smell of pine to the sour, sharp smell of sweat and mounting anxiety. The road the guide had promised turned out to be little more than a narrow game trail, requiring the men to hack through thick, thorny brush with their axes and move massive boulders by hand, while the women and children waited in the baking sun, their water barrels running dangerously low. Tabitha felt the change in the air before anyone spoke it aloud. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the wind carried a new, sharp chill. A warning from the mountains looming ahead like gray giants shrouded in mist. The familiar comfort of the wagon train routine was beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by a tension that tightened in her chest with every mile they put between themselves and the safety of Fort Hall. They were walking straight into the teeth of the wilderness, and the wilderness was finally beginning to wake up and show its true face. By the time October arrived, the illusion of the easy route had completely shattered like glass on stone. The Applegate Trail revealed its true nature. It was a punishing gauntlet of rock, thirst, and absolute exhaustion. The water sources that the guide had so confidently promised were either bone dry or so foul and stagnant that the cattle refused to touch them, even as their tongues swelled from thirst. The terrain became a nightmare of steep canyons and boulder fields that shattered wagon wheels and spirits alike. Every single day became a grueling battle just to gain a few measly miles of ground. Tabitha watched with a heavy heart as the younger members of the party began to falter, their early optimism drained away by the relentless dust and the constant threat of starvation. But it was her brother-in-law, Captain John Brown, who worried her the most. At 77 years old, the captain was a man of a different era, a veteran who had seen much of life's hardships, but this brutal slog was stripping him of his final reserves. He was becoming frail, his movements shaky and uncertain, and his mind was beginning to cloud with the fog of dehydration and fatigue. It was a cruel irony. While Tabitha's body was broken and her leg was useless, her mind remained as razor-sharp as a winter frost. The captain, however, was physically intact, but spiritually crumbling under the weight of the trail. One afternoon, as the wagons struggled up a particularly steep and rocky incline, the scarcity of their resources became terrifyingly real. They were running out of flour. The last of the bacon was long gone. The cattle were dying one by one, leaving them with less meat to eat, and More critically, less pulling power to get the heavy wagons over the ridges. Tabitha, unable to walk long distances to help lighten the load, felt the heavy burden of her own weight on the struggling, skeletal oxen. She saw the resentful glances of some of the hired hands, the silent, cold calculation of mouths to feed versus the work contributed. She knew she was being weighed in their minds, and she knew she was found wanting. It was in this crucible of despair that we see the second seed of our story being planted. While others bemoaned the lack of bread and wept for the homes they had left behind, Tabitha was looking at the ground. They were passing through groves of oak trees now, scrubby, twisted things with limbs like gnarled fingers. She saw the acorns littering the ground, hard, bitter things that were ignored by the rest of the party, who saw them only as stones to trip over. But Tabitha knew better. She knew that to the native people who had lived on this land for centuries, these weren't just rocks. They were life itself. She didn't say much to the others, but she noted their presence. She noted their abundance. As the captain groaned about the lack of biscuits and the coming winter, Tabitha's eyes lingered on those fallen nuts. She was cataloguing the tools of survival, while everyone else was cataloguing their misery. The obstacles were mounting, the mountains were closing in, and the first flakes of snow were beginning to dance in the cold grey sky. Even amidst the grinding hardship and the constant shadow of hunger, there were moments of profound human connection that anchored the drifting souls of the wagon train. It was these small, flickering lights of warmth that kept them from descending into total darkness. One evening, after a particularly grueling day where they had managed to travel only 3 agonizing miles, the convoy halted in a small, sheltered depression between 2 rising hills. The wind, which had been howling all afternoon, finally died down, and for a brief hour, the world felt strangely still. Tabitha sat near the flickering campfire, her sturdy wooden cane resting against her knee. She spent a long time rubbing the circulation back into her paralyzed leg, her fingers stiff and red from the biting air. As the stars began to poke through the gathering clouds, her daughter, Fernie, came to sit beside her. Without a word, the younger woman rested her head on Tabitha's shoulder, her body trembling slightly from exhaustion. It was a poignant reversal of roles that often happens in the wild. Usually it is the mother who comforts the child. But here, in the middle of a wilderness that wanted to break them, the daughter was seeking strength from the woman everyone else considered a cripple. They spoke in low, hushed tones, not of the miles of mud ahead, but of the homes they had left behind in Missouri. They talked about the gardens they had tended, the smell of damp earth in the spring, and the simple, forgotten pleasure of a delicate china cup filled with hot, sweetened tea. Soon, her son Orus joined them, his face deeply lined with dirt and the heavy weight of worry. He knelt in the dirt to check on his mother's leg, his touch incredibly gentle despite his rough, calloused hands. His eyes were filled with a desperate, unspoken need to protect her from the world they had chosen to enter. This quiet scene reveals the true emotional stakes of their journey. Tabitha wasn't just surviving for herself, she had become the emotional ballast for her entire family. Her children looked at her, this 66-year-old woman who refused to utter a single whimper of complaint despite her constant pain, and they found the resolve to keep their own feet moving. If she could endure the jolting, bone-shaking wagon without a word of protest, surely they could find the strength to walk just 1 more mile. But perhaps the most poignant connection of all was the one between Tabitha and her brother-in-law, Captain John. The old captain was drifting further into a dark sea of despair with every passing sun. He sat on a fallen log, staring blankly into the dying embers, muttering under his breath about the foolishness of their journey and the certainty of their doom. Tabitha didn't scold him for his lack of faith, and she didn't offer him any empty, sugary platitudes. Instead, she simply reached out and took his hand. Her gnarled, weathered fingers wrapped firmly around his. It was a silent pact, made between the two elders of the tribe. She was telling him, without needing a single word, that she was there, that she was not leaving him, and that they would see this through together or not at all. This bond, forged in the flickering firelight, would soon be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. It was a moment of calm, a deep breath before the plunge, and a deepening of love that would have to serve as their only armor against the coming storm. The fragile peace they had found by the campfire was short-lived, as the terrain itself seemed to turn vindictive. They entered the Umpqua Canyon, a geological bottleneck that would soon become infamous in the dark annals of the Oregon Trail. This was not a mountain pass in any traditional sense. It was a prison made of stone and timber. The walls of the canyon shot up vertically toward the sky, blocking out the sun for nearly the entire day and leaving the travelers in a state of perpetual, chilly twilight. The very concept of a road simply ceased to exist. In its place was a chaotic, muddy jumble of fallen trees, slick boulders, and a freezing creek that had to be crossed and recrossed dozens of times in a single mile. The wagons, which were the very vessels of their survival and the only homes they had left, began to fail under the pressure. Axles snapped with the sudden, sharp sound of gunshots echoing off the canyon walls. Heavy wooden wheels shattered against the relentless boulders, leaving the wagons slumped in the mud like dying animals. To make matters worse, the guide, the man with the silver tongue who had promised them a garden path to the valley, was nowhere to be found. He had ridden ahead, ostensibly to scout, but in reality, he had abandoned them to save his own skin, leaving the group leaderless and lost in a labyrinth of rock. Panic began to seep into the camp like a rising tide, and the group's cohesion fractured. It quickly became every family for themselves. The true twist came when the canyon floor became so rugged and broken that the wagons could no longer physically move forward. They were trapped. The oxen were far too weak to pull the heavy loads up the slick, vertical rock shelves that blocked their path. The realization hit the families like a physical blow to the stomach. They would have to abandon the wagons. Everything they owned, the heirlooms passed down through generations, the heavy furniture they hoped would fill their new homes, and the tools they needed to build a life, had to be left behind to rot in the rising mud. Tabitha watched in stony silence as her family began to unload their few remaining possessions. She saw the rain soaking the beautiful, intricate quilts she had stitched by hand over many long winters. But the complication was far worse for her than the loss of fabric and wood. Without a wagon to carry her, she was forced to ride. A woman with a paralyzed leg, who struggled just to sit upright in a steady chair, now had to mount a horse and navigate a trail that even the most able-bodied men found treacherous. The safety net was gone. The vehicle was gone. There was only the horse, the freezing mud, and the canyon that seemed to be closing its jaws around them. This was no longer a journey of migration. It had become a desperate race against the clock and the closing hand of winter. We have reached the midpoint of our story, that terrible point of no return where the world shifts irrevocably and the old rules no longer apply. The wagon train was no longer a train at all. It was a disorganized, straggling line of pack animals and desperate, hollow-eyed walkers strung out over miles of the narrow canyon floor. The strongest and the most desperate pushed ahead, driven by a primal, frantic urge to escape the claustrophobic walls before the snow cut them off forever. The weakest, however, began to lag further and further behind, their strength failing with every step into the muck. Tabitha found herself in the rear guard, the very tail end of the line. Her son, Oris, was doing his best to manage the remaining cattle and the few horses they had left, but the situation was becoming impossible. He knew that to save anyone, he had to move forward to find a path, to secure help from the settlements they hoped were ahead, and to find food before they all starved. He came to his mother, and made the most agonizing decision of his life. He told her he had to ride ahead with the stronger members of the party, intending to return as quickly as possible with relief supplies. He looked at his mother, who was mounted precariously on her horse, her bad leg tied to the stirrup for balance. Then he looked at his uncle, the captain, who was now barely responsive to the world around him. Oris had to trust that they could keep moving, even if it was slowly, and that they would follow the trail he left behind. It was a choice born of absolute necessity, but it effectively sealed Tabitha's fate. As the faster group disappeared around a sharp bend in the canyon, the silence rushed back in, heavy and terrifying. Tabitha was no longer part of a wagon train. She was part of a straggling, lonely remnant. The gap between her and safety was widening with every passing hour. She was 66 years old, paralyzed, and now, for all intents and purposes, she was on her own in the wild. She watched the back of her son as he rode away, swallowing the hard lump of fear that rose in her throat. She gripped the reins with hands that were stiff and blue from the cold, but she did not call him back. She knew he was their only hope for survival, but as the shadows lengthened and the absolute solitude of the canyon descended upon her, the reality of her position became a terrifying weight. She was the matriarch of a family that was disintegrating into the wilderness, and she had to make a choice right then and there. Would she sit still and wait to be saved, or would she keep riding until the horse collapsed beneath her? She took a deep breath, adjusted her grip on the reins, and kicked her heels into the beast's flanks. She chose to move, even if it was into the heart of the storm. The escalation of their suffering was rapid and brutal, as if the wilderness had been waiting for them to be alone before it finally struck. Winter, which had been threatening them with oppressive gray skies for weeks, arrived with a cold and sharp vengeance that seemed personal. It started as a freezing rain that soaked through their layers of wool in minutes, making every garment heavy and suffocating. The air smelled of wet pine and old rot, a damp scent that filled Tabitha's lungs with every ragged breath. That rain soon turned to stinging sleet that pelted their faces like tiny shards of glass, and finally, it transformed into heavy, wet snow that clung to the branches and the horses' manes. The canyon floor, already a treacherous mess of roots and rocks, turned into a thick black slurry of freezing mud. It sucked at the horses' hooves with every agonizing step, making a wet, rhythmic thumping sound that echoed off the canyon walls, threatening to pull the exhausted animals down into the depths. Tabitha and Captain John fell further and further behind the main group until the sounds of the others were lost to the whistling wind. The captain's horse, weak from weeks of having nothing to eat but bark and dry leaves, stumbled constantly over the hidden rocks beneath the mud. Tabitha adjusted her grip on the frozen leather reins, her fingers stiff and unyielding as she struggled to keep her seat. Her paralysis made it physically impossible for her to dismount and walk to warm her frozen blood. She was effectively trapped in the saddle, a prisoner of her own body. Her bad leg felt like a solid, heavy block of ice that didn't belong to her, while her good leg began to cramp from the constant, desperate strain of maintaining her balance as the horse lurched. She could feel the dampness seeping into her skin, a deep chill that no fire could ever truly reach. A profound moral dilemma soon presented itself in the form of their pace. Tabitha knew that to survive, they absolutely needed to move fast to reach the relief camp before the passes became completely impassable. But for the captain, moving at all had become a Herculean task that pushed him to the brink of collapse. He began to plead with her in a voice that was thin and reedy, like a ghost's whispering through the pines. "Let us rest, Tabitha," he would say, his eyes sunken and pleading from beneath the brim of his sodden hat. "Just for a moment, let us sit and catch our breath." It would have been so easy to say yes, to give in to her own exhaustion and find a dry spot beneath a cedar tree. But Tabitha knew the dark truth of the winter. In this kind of soul-crushing cold, to stop moving was to invite certain death. Hypothermia is a seductive and patient killer. It whispers promises of sleep, comfort and warmth, even as it slowly shuts down the heart and lungs. Tabitha realized she had to become the antagonist to his desire for rest. She had to be cruel to him to be kind, acting as the iron will he no longer possessed. She badgered him, she shouted at him over the whistling wind, and she used every ounce of her remaining strength to force him to keep his horse moving forward. She was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the freezing elements that sought to turn them into statues, and another against the surrender that was growing like a cancer inside the captain's heart. The hunger was now a constant physical pain, a gnawing emptiness in her stomach that made her head swim with dizzying waves of nausea. They had no bread left. They had no meat. The only things surrounding them were the dripping dark forest and the cold, indifferent grey rock. Every lurch of the horse was a fresh spasm of agony for Tabitha, yet she rode on, her jaw set in a line of iron. She would not let the silence of the canyon claim them without a fight. But as the light began to fade and the shadows grew long across the snow, she wondered how much longer a human spirit could hold out against the crushing weight of the void. Then came the night that nearly ended everything. The horses, pushed far beyond the limits of any living creature, could simply go no further. Their heads hung low, their breath coming in ragged frozen plumes that vanished instantly into the biting air. The smell of wet horsehair and old leather was thick around them, a heavy scent of pure exhaustion. In the confusing shadows of the canyon and the fading grey light, Tabitha and Captain John became completely separated from the few others who had been trailing near them. The voices of their companions had drifted away into the wind, leaving only the sound of their own labored breathing and the rhythmic creak of the saddles. They were utterly alone in the dark. They came to a halt in a small, miserable clearing just as the sun died behind the jagged canyon rim, turning the sky a bruised, sickly purple. They had no tent to shield them from the elements. They had no blankets, as those had been packed away on the animals that had gone ahead with the stronger party, leaving them with only the thin, soaked layers of their day clothes. They had absolutely no food, and the gnawing hunger in their bellies felt like a physical, aching wound. Tabitha managed to slide from her horse, but her legs collapsed under her the moment she hit the frozen ground. She lay there in the slush, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that burned her throat. The mud was a gritty, freezing paste that soaked through her heavy skirts in seconds. The captain fell beside her, his movements slow and heavy as if he were moving through deep water. He looked at her with eyes that had lost every spark of light, his face a pale, hollow mask in the gloom. "I can go no further, Tabitha," he whispered into the wind, his voice trembling with a finality that chilled her more than the snow. "We must die here. It is over." He pulled his thin coat tight around his chest, his fingers fumbling uselessly with the buttons, and lay down in the freezing mud, closing his eyes to finally welcome the end. This was the absolute nadir of their journey. A paralyzed widow and a 77-year-old man, abandoned in the freezing slush of the Oregon wilderness, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The darkness was total, a suffocating blanket that seemed to swallow the very air they breathed. The cold felt like a physical weight, a cold hand pressing the life out of their lungs. Tabitha sat there, shivering so violently her teeth rattled together with a rhythmic, clicking sound. She looked at the man she had promised to protect, feeling a crushing weight of responsibility and the bitter sting of failure. It seemed impossible that they could survive until dawn. If you're sitting there holding your breath, wondering how anyone could possibly survive a night like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Stories of human resilience like Tabitha's are rare, and we make sure they are never forgotten. Your support helps us keep these fires burning. As she sat in the mud, Tabitha felt the hot tears begin to freeze on her weathered cheeks, stinging her skin like needles. She was angry at the guide who had misled them into this trap. She was terrified of the vast, indifferent dark, and she was grieving for the comfortable life she had left behind in Missouri. But as she looked at the captain's still, silent form, a tiny spark ignited deep in her chest. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was a fierce, stubborn refusal to accept this ending. She refused to let this nameless canyon win. She thought of her children waiting in the valley and the life she still intended to lead. With a low grunt of effort, she began to drag her paralyzed body toward the base of a small, gnarled oak tree that stood like a lonely sentinel at the edge of the clearing. Her fingers dug deep into the frozen earth, her nails breaking against the hidden stones as she pulled herself forward inch by agonizing inch. She was not ready to die. Not tonight. Not ever. The rally began not with a heroic shout or a sudden rescue, but with a desperate, mud-caked scavenge. In the darkness, the wind picked up, whistling through the jagged rocks and rattling the bare branches of the trees above with a hollow, lonely sound. Tabitha remembered the acorns. Those bitter, hard little nuts she had seen littering the trail days ago were here too, hidden beneath the slush and the rotting leaves. While the captain lay in the mud preparing himself for death, his breath coming in shallow, fluttering sighs that barely disturbed the freezing air, Tabitha dragged herself through the underbrush like a soldier in a trench. She used her sturdy wooden cane to sweep away the thin layer of snow, and she used her bare, frozen hands to sift through the freezing mud. The earth was cold enough to burn her skin, but she didn't stop, her fingers digging deep into the grit and ice. She found one, then she found another. Soon she had a small, precious handful of the hard, brown seeds. These weren't just nuts to her anymore. They were concentrated energy. They were life itself. She cracked the hard shells open with her teeth, the bitter, astringent taste shocking her dry mouth and making her wince. But she chewed them with a grim determination. She crawled back to the captain and shook him awake with a strength that surprised even her. She didn't ask him if he wanted to eat. She forced the bitter acorns into his shaking hand and closed his fingers around them, her own hand trembling with the effort. "Eat," she commanded, her voice cracking but firm. "We are not dying tonight, John. Not on my watch." There was no fire to warm their frozen limbs, so Tabitha became the fire herself. She huddled as close to the captain as she could, sharing her meager body heat and using her own body to shield him from the worst of the biting wind that smelled of ice and old pine. The silence of the canyon was absolute, broken only by the occasional snap of a frozen twig. To keep him conscious and tethered to the world, she began to talk. She told him stories of the past, of the warm Missouri summers and the scent of blooming jasmine on the porch. But more importantly, she began to weave a future out of thin air. She spoke of the school she wanted to start in the valley, the sturdy house they would build together, and the smell of fresh bread they would one day share. She constructed a world of words to replace the bleak, frozen reality of the canyon, building a home out of her own breath. The acorns provided just enough sustenance to keep their internal metabolic fires burning through the long, dark hours. But more importantly, Tabitha's act of gathering them changed the entire dynamic of their survival. She was no longer a victim of the canyon. She had become a forager. She was a provider. The small detail from the beginning of our story, her sharp eye for nature's hidden pantry, paid off in the most spectacular and humble way possible. She was saving her family with the very things everyone else had stepped over. That night, amidst the roots of an old oak tree, the paralyzed grandmother became the strongest, most formidable person on the entire Oregon Trail. But just as the first light of dawn began to touch the canyon rim, a new sound echoed through the trees. making her heart skip a beat and her breath catch in her throat. They survived that first long, freezing night, tucked beneath the gnarled, protective roots of the oak tree. The air around them smelled of damp earth and the sharp, metallic scent of fresh snow. And then, against every law of nature and every expectation of the trail, they survived the next night, and the one after that. For 3 long, agonizing days, this impossible duo held their ground in the heart of the frozen wilderness. Each morning, as the weak gray light of dawn filtered through the jagged canyon walls, Tabitha would rally herself, pushing past the exhaustion that felt like lead in her veins. She would fight the bone-deep stiffness in her paralyzed leg, dragging her body through the freezing slush to gather more of those bitter acorns. She became a creature of the forest, sifting through the white powder with fingers that had long since lost all feeling, her nails cracked and stained. She fed herself, and more importantly, she fed the captain. He remained weak, his breath coming in shallow, ragged plumes that hung in the air like ghosts. But he stayed alive, tethered to this world by nothing more than Tabitha's sheer, unbreakable stubbornness. The psychological toll of those 3 days was immense, a weight heavier than the snow piling up around them. They were like ghosts haunting a canyon, waiting for a rescue that their logical minds knew might never come. In the oppressive silence, Tabitha's mind began to play cruel tricks on her. She would suddenly jerk her head, certain she heard the distant rhythmic creak of wagon wheels on the trail. She even imagined she could smell the rich salt scent of frying bacon wafting through the trees, a memory of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. But she never once let the captain see her falter. She maintained a strict, almost military schedule, a grim routine of survival that kept the encroaching darkness at bay. She would gather, they would eat, they would huddle for warmth under their thin, damp layers, and then they would wait for the sun to die again. The tension reached its peak on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The snow was getting noticeably deeper, and their physical strength was fading into a dangerous, heavy lethargy. Even the acorns were getting harder to find as the drifts covered the forest floor in a seamless white blanket. Tabitha knew in her heart that they were on a final countdown. They could not last through another major storm. She sat beside the captain, watching the empty trail with eyes that burned from the relentless, blinding glare of the snow. The silence of the canyon was deafening, a heavy pressure against her ears that made her head throb. It was the calm before the final storm, that quiet, terrifying moment where fate decides whether you live to see the spring or become a legend told in whispers around future campfires. She gripped her wooden cane until her knuckles turned white, her breath hitching in her chest as she watched a single, dark bird circle overhead. She was waiting for a sign, for a sound, for anything at all that wasn't the hollow, mocking howl of the winter wind. The climax of this ordeal began with a sound that simply didn't belong in that frozen tomb. For hours, the only sound had been the rhythmic, shallow breathing of the captain and the distant, lonely creak of frozen branches under the weight of the ice. Then, it happened. It wasn't the moan of the wind, and it wasn't the groan of a falling branch. It was the sharp, distinct snap of a dry twig, a sound that cut through the silence like a gunshot. It was followed by the heavy, rhythmic snort of a horse, but it wasn't their horse. Tabitha raised her head slowly, her neck stiff and protesting, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Through the thick, snow-laden trees, a figure finally emerged from the gloom, looking more like a ghost than a man. It wasn't a stranger, and it wasn't a hostile force. It was Horus. Her son had actually returned for them. He had ridden back alone from the relief party, retracing the hellish muddy trail and searching every thicket and hollow for the mother and uncle he refused to grieve. When Orus first saw them, two huddled, motionless heaps beneath the twisted oak tree, partially covered by a fresh, shimmering layer of snow, his heart sank into his boots. The world felt cold and empty, and for a terrifying second, he truly thought he was too late. He expected to find only silence and the stillness of the dead. But then, Tabitha moved. She reached out a gloved hand, her fingers trembling with the immense effort of the gesture. The reunion that followed was not a gentle, tearful hug. There was no time for the luxury of emotion. It was a frantic, desperate scramble for life. Orus knelt beside them, his own face encrusted with frost and his eyes bloodshot from the wind, and fumbled to pull a small scrap of dried meat from his coat. He had brought a small amount of food, but more importantly, he had brought a sense of absolute urgency. He told them they had to move, and they had to move right now. The main relief party was still miles ahead, and the sky was already darkening into a deep, bruised purple with the promise of another blizzard. He lifted the captain, who was now little more than a bundle of brittle bones and wet wool, and hoisted him onto a horse. The captain didn't even have the strength to hold the leather reins, his head lolling against his chest. Then Orus turned to his mother. He lifted Tabitha, her paralyzed leg practically useless and heavy as lead with the biting cold, and hoisted her into the saddle. This final confrontation was not with a person but with the canyon itself. They had to ride out or die right there in the drifts. Tabitha, fueled by the bitter energy of the acorns and the sheer, overwhelming sight of her son's face, summoned a reserve of strength that defied everything she knew about her own body. She gripped the leather pommel with everything she had left, her knuckles white and aching. She gritted her teeth against the white-hot agony that flared through her hip with every jolt of the horse as it struggled to find its footing. They moved through the mounting snow, the horses wading chest-deep in the drifts in some places, their breath coming in great billowing clouds of steam. It was a literal race against the setting sun and the rising wind that whistled through the canyon walls. Every step the horse took was a victory over the grave. Every mile they covered was a miracle of the human spirit. Tabitha Brown was not just traveling, she was riding her way out of a tomb she had refused to occupy. But the shadows were growing longer. The cold was deepening by the second, and the relief camp was still nowhere in sight. The ride to safety was a chaotic blur of white snow, sharp physical pain, and surging adrenaline. Every jolt of the horse sent a fresh wave of agony through Tabitha's body, radiating from her hips down to her paralyzed legs. But she didn't let out a single sound of complaint. The wind screamed through the skeletal trees, a constant, howling reminder of the freezing power they were finally escaping. But the true decisive moment, the one that would be whispered about in Oregon for 100 years, came when they finally crested the last jagged ridge. The air was thin and bit at their lungs like 1,000 needles. But as they reached the peak, the world seemed to open up before them in a vast white expanse. Below, nestled in the shelter of the valley, they saw the thin gray curls of wood smoke rising from the relief camp. It was a sight so beautiful and so unlikely that it felt like a hallucination born of hunger. They had made it out of the Umpqua Canyon alive. But the real twist in this tale wasn't just the fact of their survival, it was the sheer, defiant condition of their arrival. You see, the relief party had already written them off. Down in that camp, the fire crackled, and the men spoke in hushed tones about the tragedy they expected to find up the trail. They were seasoned frontiersmen, men who had seen the wilderness swallow the young and the strong without leaving so much as a trace of their passing. They were prepared to find frozen bodies to bury, not living survivors to feed. They had their shovels ready and their faces set in grim masks of duty, expecting to find nothing but a graveyard beneath the drifts. Tabitha rode into that camp, not as a broken victim or a shivering corpse, but as a queen of the wilderness returning to her people. Her heavy wool dress, once a symbol of her quiet life in the East, was now in tattered ribbons that fluttered in the freezing breeze like battle flags. Her face was scorched a deep, angry red by the wind and the biting cold, and her hands were stained with the dark, iron-rich mud of the canyon floor. But her head was held high, her spine as straight as a lodgepole pine, despite the exhaustion. She had brought the captain through the valley of death, guiding him when he could no longer guide himself. She had kept the silent promise she made by the campfire weeks ago, a promise made in the dark when hope was nothing more than a flickering ember. As she was helped down from her horse, those hardened men who had fought bears and survived the harshest winters, looked at this 66-year-old disabled woman with a sense of genuine, silent awe. They saw the blood on her hem and the fierce, unyielding fire in her eyes, and for a moment the entire camp went still. They had never seen anything like it. It was as if a legend had stepped out of the woods and into the firelight, defying every law of nature they understood. This was the ultimate victory, enabled by every trait we saw in her from the beginning: her quiet resilience, her deep knowledge of the natural world, and her absolute refusal to accept the limitations of her own body. The acorns, which had been the symbol of her lowest, most desperate moment when she was crawling through the dirt, had become the badge of her triumph. They were the tangible proof that she had seen a way where everyone else saw an end. She finally slid from the horse, her legs buckling as the adrenaline finally began to drain away. She collapsed into the shaking, tear-streaked arms of her family, who could hardly believe she was real. She wasn't falling in defeat. She was succumbing to an absolute, hard-earned exhaustion that went down to her very marrow. She had stared down the winter, she had stared down her own paralysis, and she had stared down starvation itself. And in the end, it was the wilderness that blinked first. When they finally arrived in the lush Willamette Valley, the calendar said it was Christmas Day, 1846. The air here was thick and heavy with the scent of damp earth and growing things, a sharp contrast to the sterile, frozen smell of the canyon they had left behind. By all rights, it should have been a festive occasion, a time of celebration and great joy, perhaps marked by the smell of roasting meat and the sound of carols echoing through a warm home. But for Tabitha and her family, the reality of their situation was stark and unforgiving. They had lost almost everything they owned in the world. The sturdy wagons that had once been their homes on wheels, carrying their lives across the continent, were gone, left to rot and sink into the unforgiving mud of the Umpqua. Their furniture, the hand-carved chairs and the heavy oak chests, their extra clothes, their precious family heirlooms, and every single cent of their life savings had been abandoned to the wilderness. Tabitha stood in the promised land with nothing but the tattered, salt-stained clothes on her back and a skirt that was more holes than fabric, the hem frayed into useless threads that danced in the breeze. But as she looked around the valley, seeing the grass green and vibrant even in the heart of winter, she felt a profound sense of relief wash over her, like a heavy weight finally being lifted from her shoulders. She watched her grandchildren playing near a stand of fir trees, their laughter a sound she hadn't heard in weeks. The terror of the Umpqua was finally behind them, a nightmare fading into the morning light. The captain was alive, resting nearby, his breath coming steady and strong as he recovered from the ordeal. The falling action of our story is not one of immediate comfort or wealth, but of immediate, overwhelming gratitude. They were destitute, yes. They were technically homeless beggars in a strange new land where they knew no one, but they were alive, and they were together, and that was a miracle in itself. As she was cleaning out the pockets of an old mud-stained glove she had managed to save, the leather cracked and stiff from the cold. Tabitha's fingers brushed against something small and hard. She pulled it out and found a single coin, a tiny silver picayune. It was the only money she had left in the entire world, a lonely piece of silver that seemed far too small to matter. She held it up between her thumb and forefinger, watching the weak, pale winter sun glint off the small silver disc. To anyone else it was a pittance, barely enough to buy a single meal or a loaf of bread. But to Tabitha, that coin was a seed. It was just like the acorn she had found in the mud during their darkest hour. She closed her hand tightly around it, feeling the cold metal press into her palm, and her resolve hardened once again. She had survived the impossible. She had stared down death and won, and she wasn't about to let a little thing like poverty stop her now. The relief she felt wasn't a warm bath. It was a cold, steely determination to rebuild everything they had lost from the ground up. She looked out at the horizon, her eyes narrowing. The journey was over, but the struggle for a future was just beginning. The resolution of Tabitha Brown's story is a testament to the same grit and ingenuity that had seen her through the canyon. She didn't sit down in the valley and wait for charity to find her, nor did she let the bitterness of her losses poison her heart. No, she took that single silver picayune and she bought herself some needles and a few spools of sturdy thread from a small merchant's cabin that smelled of damp wool and wood smoke. She looked around at the local settlers and the Kalapuya natives, noticing the rough, poorly made buckskin gloves they wore to protect their hands from the thick, thorny brush of the valley. They were clumsy things, stitched with heavy cord that bit into the skin and offered little real protection. She knew she could make them better. She knew she could make them last, and more importantly, she knew she could make them comfortable enough for a full day's labor. And so, she began to sew. Her fingers, which had so recently been frozen around a horse's reins in a howling blizzard, now began to dance with a needle. The rhythmic pull of the thread and the soft, repetitive sound of the needle piercing the leather became the soundtrack of her new life. She made gloves that were famous for their durability and fit, often working late into the night by the flickering, warm light of a tallow candle while the wind rattled the window panes. She traded them for food to fill her family's bellies, for basic supplies like salt and flour, and eventually for the capital she needed to start a real business. But the woman who would become known as the Mother of Oregon didn't stop there. As she moved through the growing settlements, she saw the orphans of the trail, children with hollow eyes and tattered coats, whose parents hadn't been as lucky or as resilient as she was. She saw their hunger and their total lack of direction, and she simply couldn't look away. The memory of her own moments of despair in the canyon made their plight unbearable to her. She partnered with a local reverend to establish a school for these forgotten children in the Tualatin Plains. This wasn't just a temporary shelter meant to keep the rain off their heads. She envisioned a true academy of learning that would provide a foundation for their lives. She cooked the heavy iron pots of meals. She cleaned the wooden floors on her hands and knees despite the constant, dull ache in her paralyzed leg. She taught the lessons from the few precious books they had, and she managed the dormitory with the same meticulous care she had used to pack her wagon in Missouri. The woman who was left to die in a frozen canyon had become the very cornerstone of education in the entire Oregon Territory. Her transformation was complete. The paralyzed widow was now a founding mother, a pillar of a growing community who had turned her own trauma into a legacy of care and learning that would outlast her by centuries. But as she looked out over the valley, she knew that the story of the trail was never truly finished, and there were still many secrets left to be discovered in the shadows of the mountains. In the year 1854, Tabitha sat down in her quiet home to write a long, detailed letter to her brother back in Ohio. The room where she sat smelled of seasoned wood and the faint, sweet scent of lavender from the dried flowers resting on the windowsill. Outside, a gentle Oregon rain pattered softly against the glass, a rhythmic sound that was a far cry from the freezing sleet of the Umpqua Canyon. She dipped her quill into the inkwell, the nib scratching softly against the parchment as she reflected on the long years that had passed since her arrival. It was in those pages that she penned the line that would forever define her place in history. "I had nothing to eat but acorns." But she also wrote with immense pride about the legacy she was leaving behind. That little log cabin academy for orphans, which had once been a simple refuge for the forgotten children of the trail, had grown and flourished beyond her wildest expectations. It was eventually chartered as Pacific University, an institution that stands as a beacon of higher learning to this very day. Tabitha Brown's journey teaches us that true strength has very little to do with physical perfection or youthful vigor. It isn't about having the best equipment or the easiest path through the mountains. It is about the absolute, iron-willed refusal to surrender even when the world turns to ice and the shadows grow long. It is about looking at the bitter acorns on the ground and seeing a feast where others see only stones. It is about dragging your loved ones toward the light, even when you can no longer see it yourself. Tabitha died in 1858, a legend in her own time, proving to everyone that it is never too late to be a hero. Whether you are 66 or 16, whether you are paralyzed by fear or physical pain, Tabitha's story is a reminder to us all. Keep moving, keep gathering, and never, ever give up on the road ahead. If the story of the unstoppable Tabitha Brown moved you today, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. There are countless forgotten voices like hers in the pages of history, waiting to be heard, and with your support, we can keep their stories alive for the next generation. We have many more tales from the frontier to share, so hit that notification bell and stay tuned. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your heart close to the fire.